YouTube! This noob is still learning about skills in Pathfinder 2nd edition. So there's actually a lot to cover in this video and we're just gonna get right into it. But before we jump into it, as always, please do not forget your comments help so much when it comes to helping me and this video. So please keep leaving them. And while you're there, don't forget to like and don't forget to subscribe. Okay, let's jump into it. Pathfinder Noob Learn Skills Part 2. Medicine. You can patch up wounds and help people recover from diseases and poisons. I feel like magic can really trivialize diseases in 5th edition with Cure Disease. Poison, not so much, but diseases feel like an entire plot point, and when your plot is just you're cured now, it's kind of underwhelming. As I continue to learn about the diseases in Pathfinder, I'm curious to see if it has the same problem where there's just a spell that simply makes it all go away. Recall knowledge about diseases, injuries, poisons, and other ailments. You can use this to perform forensic examinations if you spend 10 minutes checking for evidence such as wound pattern. This is most useful when determining how a body was injured or killed. It kind of gives just like this detective vibe. It's just like the usage of the word forensic and wound patterns that make it feel like we're playing CSI D&D. I've always wanted to do a campaign that was about a serial killer in some way, shape, or form, and this seems just like, oh, I like this for that. Administer First Aid. Requirements. You are holding healer's tools or you're wearing them and have a hand free. Oh, cool. So you can just like wear your tools. I think that's really awesome. Looking into healer's tools is also really cool. A healer's kit in 5e is admittedly a little underwhelming in comparison. It allows you to just stabilize an unconscious creature without doing a medicine check. There's a feat that makes it a little bit better, but even then it's still underwhelming. If you take the healer feat, using a healer's kit gives 1 HP to an unconscious character. Additionally, you can use an action to give 1d6 plus 4 HP as well as adding their max hit dice total, which is pretty sizable, especially for just an action. Healer's tools just seem a bit better in Pathfinder. There's a lot more versatility to them, and you can also wear them, which is a neat little bonus. It really gives a medic vibe, which isn't something that's common in 5th edition. There's healers, but there's no one that really gives off a medic vibe. You perform first aid on a creature that is dying and or bleeding. Choose which ailment you're trying to treat before you roll. You can administer first aid again to attempt to remedy the other effect. The thing that makes this feel like it has such a bigger impact is that bleeding is an extra condition that you can solve with a healer's kit. It gives so much extra use to something that's typically a little bit more one-dimensional, at least on paper. In most games that I've ever played, poison is something that you just let happen and forget about. So I'm not sure how often people are actually going to be using this to get rid of conditions. It feels like a lot of your action is being lost, but in 5th edition, that's your whole action, whereas this is just a single action. Stabilize. Attempt a medicine check on a creature that has 0 hit points in the dying condition. The DC is equal to 5 plus that creature's recovery roll DC, typically 15 plus its dying value. Stop bleeding. Attempt a medicine check on a creature that is taking persistent bleed damage, giving them a chance to make another flat check to remove the persistent damage. The DC is usually the DC of the effect that caused the bleed. Specifically for bleeding, it feels kind of weird to make a roll to give them a chance to roll again. It makes me feel very similar to the way that aid works, where it's just kind of like a Rube Goldberg machine of eventually getting to overcome something. I kind of wish that you were just, hey, I'm a medic, I'm gonna stop the bleeding. So if I succeed, it's done. On the plus side, it's not like they have to roll to then also get stabilized, so that's nice. The critical failure is rough though. I feel like it could be a great moment for character building if you were a healer in charge of saving your friend and you botched a roll and killed them instead. Treat disease. You spend at least 8 hours caring for a diseased creature. Attempt a medicine check against the disease's DC. After you attempt to treat a disease for a creature, you can't try again until the creature's next save against the disease. I think my lack of knowledge in terms of diseases in Pathfinder is a bit of a detriment here, so let's see what we can find. Oh wow, these are like really in depth and like really great. I don't know if there's any diseases in 5e with this much depth. We're just gonna use blinding sickness as an example for everything here. Saving throw. DC 23 Fortitude. Stage 1. Carrier with no effects. 1 day. Stage 2. Enfeebled 1. 1 day. Stage 3. Enfeebled 2. 1 day. Stage 4. Enfeebled 2 and permanently blinded. 1 day. Stage 5. Enfeebled 4. 1 day. Stage 6. Unconscious. 1 day. Stage 7, death. I'm curious with a disease like this if you could even attempt to treat it on the first day, since you're just a carrier. And at the same time, I'd almost want to do some like medical investigations prior to trying to treat the disease to even know what disease you're trying to treat. I suppose you could just lump both of them in together, but I think it would be a lot cooler to roll first to identify the disease, and then depending on that roll, it changes the DC of trying to treat the disease. Also, depending on what stage you were at, would raise or lower the DC of trying to identify the disease in the first place. At stage 4, it might be far more obvious to realize permanently blinded and enfeebled, that means that this is likely blinding sickness, but if you're just enfeebled and you were a carrier for a day, how are you really gonna know? I feel like D&D has spoiled me. I don't know what I expected to see here, but what I'm seeing feels less than what I want. You pass the check, and that makes it easier for them to pass the check. But if they fail, you have to do it again? At the very least, I think if the person administering the medicine succeeds, the DC would be lower for following checks. I know how to treat this disease, so it should just be easier and easier and easier for me to be able to treat it for you. Either way, diseases still feel far cooler in Pathfinder, and I hope there isn't just a spell that makes them disappear. Treat poison. I'm really not gonna waste time reading the stuff for treat poison. They're exactly the same. Requirements, description, success states. The only difference is that disease is replaced by poison. Instead of spending 8 hours to do it, you're spending a single action. In 5e, you need an antitoxin, which gives you a better chance at saving against the poison, but there's no outright way to cure it without magic. Treat wounds. You spend 10 minutes treating one injured living creature, targeting yourself if you so choose. The target is temporarily immune to treat wounds actions for 1 hour, but this interval overlaps with the time you spent treating. So a patient can be treated once per hour, not once per 70 minutes. I know it's really easy to get tripped up on technical writing, and there's probably a lot of debates on what one thing means versus another, but the end of this sentence feels so hilariously pedantic. The medicine check DC is usually 15, but the DC can be increased to add additional hit points if your proficiency is of a certain level as shown in this table. If you succeed at your check, you can continue treating the target to grant additional healing. If you treat them for a total of 1 hour, double the hit points they regain from treat wounds. I've never really had issue with 5e's long rest or short rest rules and suspending my disbelief as you go to bed and wake up fully healed, or you just sit there for an hour and your wounds heal for however many hit dice you roll. But there's something about this that just feels more real. You're applying an action to literally treat wounds. What I don't like is that there's a chance of failure for something that just exists in 5th edition. I would almost prefer to see that resources are just depleted and there's a chance to make the most out of it, but if I'm only losing 10 minutes of time, I guess that's not really a huge deal. Hurting them instead seems a bit excessive, but having 4 states of failure, it almost feels like an obligation to use them all sometimes. Nature. You know a great deal about the natural world, and you command and train animals and magical beasts. What excites me most here is that they use the term magical beasts. The vast majority of beasts in 5th edition are not magical. I think all of them are not magical. They're just normal animals and occasionally dinosaurs or giant versions of normal animals. I think that this is in large part due to druids being able to transform into beasts, but I'm not sure. I still always think that it's a little underwhelming that a hippogriff isn't considered a beast. A griffin isn't considered a beast. It seems bestial. It just seems like a magical beast. But I think what 5e did was they just took anything that was kind of a magical beast and gave it the monstrosity moniker. Which makes me very curious to see what the beast list in Pathfinder looks like, as well as how druids do their wild shape, if at all, in Pathfinder. Command an animal. You issue an order to an animal. Attempt a nature check against the animal's will DC. You automatically fail if the animal is hostile or unfriendly to you. One of the most common scenarios that I've seen played out is when the party goes up against some form of wild animal, whether it be beast or monstrosity, and then attempting animal handling to calm down and de-escalate the situation versus just outright killing it. And with the way that this is worded, that checks automatically fail if the creature is hostile towards you, that's impossible. Maybe trying to soothe its aggression wouldn't necessarily be a command, and so that means that it doesn't fall under this umbrella. Regardless, I don't think I'd let a lot of automatic fails happen. I think that it's just a good way to give DMs an out for some of the things that they normally don't feel like they'd have an out to. I think there's a good mix of having the ability to say no and having the ability for really cool moments to happen begrudgingly sometimes. You might command an animal more easily with a feat like Ride. Let's take a peek into the ride feat just because I'm a little curious about what it says. When you command an animal you're mounted on to take the move action, such as stride, you automatically succeed instead of needing to attempt to check. Any animal you're mounted on acts on your turn like a minion. If you mount an animal in the middle of an encounter, it skips its next turn and then acts on your next turn. This is a really cool feat, especially in a campaign where you come across beasts often and can often use them to be mounts. However, this brings up some weird 5e confusion when it comes to horses that you buy. If you have a mount that you own, that you've trained, whether it be a horse you've bought or one you've grown up with, do you still have to command an animal every time you want the horse to move? It seems like the mounting process in Pathfinder is again very different from 5th edition in that it's just needlessly punishing. I understand the trade-off is probably, yes, you still use an action to stride, but now you have the horse's movement instead of your own, so you're moving further. But that's still the case in 5e, and you don't have to expend your action, you're expending the horse's action. But this feat makes it seem like even if you purchased a horse that was already trained, you'd have to spend your action to then make it stride on your turn. So all of your movement is still tied up into your own action economy. Which, I don't know, I think 5e's movement has still just really spoiled me, and having to use so many actions to move in Pathfinder seems like a lot. Especially considering you have a chance to fail your movement. That's what I don't like a lot. I am curious to know what a minion is though, and I wonder if a minion is just what a purchased horse would be if you were riding that. It seems like minions have different rules than mounting normal animals, so maybe you wouldn't have to command it. Either way, it seems a little bit excessive and punishing, but it does give more credence to the nature skill, even if it is more punishing and feels a little bit excessive. While animal handling isn't a skill in Pathfinder 2nd edition, this skill action feels a lot like its replacement. And animal handling is an extraordinarily underwhelming skill in 5th edition in the first place, so for this to just be under the nest of nature is already an improvement. There's not a critical success state, which I think is pretty weird. I don't know what I would make the critical success state if I were to add one. Not that I think that you should, but the first thing that comes to mind is just making the movement free if you critically succeed. Occultism. You know a great deal about ancient philosophies, esoteric lore, obscure mysticism, and supernatural creatures. I was actually really excited to see what you would find under occultism. It's nothing. There's nothing here. I do really love the idea of occultism though. It adds this spooky nature to Pathfinder as a generality that just doesn't exist. I feel like a lot of players in my games generally try to involve some sort of Lovecraftian horror, or myself as a DM do the same thing, and occultism feels like that avenue is just right there ready to be taken. The things that you can recall knowledge about when it comes to occultism are just wonderful facets of world building inspiration for your own setting. What ancient mysteries, occult philosophies, or supernatural creatures exist in your world? Performance. You are skilled at a form of performance, using your talents to impress a crowd or make a living. Some performances require you to be more than charismatic, and if you don't meet the demands of the art form or the audience, the GM might apply a penalty based on the relevant ability score. For example, if you're dancing and have a negative dexterity modifier, you might take a penalty to your attempt at dancing. I feel like D&D has ruined me. There's not much going on in D&D that reminds you that you're bad at things or gives you negatives. I know that a lot of old school players love their minuses for some reason, but I was really happy when they got rid of that. I want to be free to put my ability scores where I want to put my ability scores, and when I have a concept for a character in mind that I want to play, I don't feel like I'm at a detriment for taking that class because it's got a negative or because it's charisma based when I want to be strength based. I appreciate how it's applied here, but I think innate charisma is something that can overcome even your most lacking abilities. So if you're lacking in something, this should not come off as a punishment. If anything, it should just go far to show how charismatic you actually are. Perform. When making a brief performance, one song, a quick dance, or a few jokes, you use the perform action. This action is most useful when you want to prove your capability or impress someone quickly. We gotta hype up what's about to happen next, because I have never seen something that was so self-deprecating in the writing of its own rule before. This is fucking hilarious. Performing rarely has an impact on its own. Look guys, we get it. Performance doesn't often have a use. You know that, we know that. It's okay. We still gotta throw it in here anyway, because honestly, how else are people gonna be able to perform the interpretive dance that lets the bard fuck the dragon? Performing rarely has an impact on its own, but it might influence the DCs of subsequent diplomacy checks against the observers, or even change their attitudes if the GM sees fit. Alright, so it does have some use, but it's still funny. Wow, not a single inclusion of tips. Always tip your street performers. These words are harsh. To be fair, if you demonstrate only incompetence, you're competently incompetent. So you're doing something right, just not the thing that you tried. Religion. The secrets of deities, dogma, faith, and the realms of divine creatures, both sublime and sinister, are open to you. You also understand how magic works, though your training imparts a religious slant to that knowledge. I just checked, and 5e's description of religion does not include magic whatsoever, which I appreciate much more in Pathfinder for having. I think it's also worth noting that in 5th edition, religion is an intelligence-based skill when the vast majority of casters that are divine in nature that would have the religion skill are wisdom-based casters. For something based in intelligence, it's a very dumb decision. Although I would respect Pathfinder so much if they changed religion to a wisdom skill, but made clerics intelligence-based casters. Irony at its finest. Is that irony? I don't think I ever know what irony means. Society. You understand the people and the systems that make civilization run, and you know the historical events that make societies what they are today. Further, you can use that knowledge to navigate the complex physical, societal, and economical workings of settlements. Society is one of my favorite additions to Pathfinder skills. I feel like they removed history and then just had this massive conversation about how they could be more specific in their skills. And so with that, we have lore, which is just every single thing history could be specified, and then society, which is just societal history, sociology, and street smarts all wrapped into one nice skill. Create Forgery. You create a forged document, usually over the course of a day or week. I continue to be fascinated that general tool proficiencies are just nested within specific skills. You don't need to be proficient in a forger's kit, you just need to have a forger's kit and be proficient in society, and society can do more than just forgeries. If you succeed, the forgery is good enough quality that passive observers can't notice the fake. Only those who carefully examine the document and attempt a perception or society check against your society DC can do so. I feel like I'm cursed to never really think broad enough to use these things in more fun situations. I've used a forgery kit maybe one time to help benefit my character, but I've had that proficiency since level 1, we're level 11, and I've never used it. But there's something about having a forgery kit and using it to create something that puts you in a really tense situation where you could be caught at any minute is just so... It's the anxiety that I want to have in my life. If the document's handwriting doesn't need to be specific to a person, you need only to have seen a similar document before, and you gain up to a +4 circumstance bonus to your check, as well as to your DC. To forge a specific person's handwriting, you need a sample of that person's handwriting. This continues to just be blanketed things that I use as a GM, but it's really nice to see these kinds of things written into the rules for newer GMs. If your check result was below a 20, the forgery has some obvious signs of being a fake. So the GM compares your results to each passive observer's perception DC or society DC, whichever is higher, using the success or failure results below. Once the GM rolls your check for a document, the same result is used against all passive observers DCs, no matter how many creatures passively observe that document. Okay, so I had to reread this a few times and I still don't know if I fully understand. Even if you fail the DC, there's a chance that they don't recognize that it's a forgery. So if you roll a 15, the DC to spot it is 15, but if it's less than a 20, it's obvious. But if they roll or their DC is lower than a 15, they don't know. I don't understand. It's using too many numbers at the same time for something else. Why can't it just be, hey, roll this number, and if their DC is lower than that, you win, and if their DC is higher than that, you lose. This is confusing as fuck. This is weird. This check, I think, is where everything started to come together for me in my head about secretly rolling checks as the DM. The more that I think about the anxiety that I'd feel going into a situation not knowing what I rolled on the forger check, the more I kind of like that agency being taken away from me. The investment into the action, regardless of knowing whether it passes or fails, is an investment that my character would have have, but I would also have some hesitation going into it if I knew I rolled a 10. Though I do understand that there are people who do not like that agency being taken away from them, and I think that this should be something that is more situationally approached as a table as opposed to just an implementation of the rules. But I will say, those of you who don't want your agency taken away from you, try it. Just give it a chance. I think that having that agency taken away is something that is scary and seems weird at first, but the more you start to let go, the more potential for fun you might have. An observer who is fooled on a passive glance can still choose to closely scrutinize the documents on the lookout for a forgery, using different techniques and analysis methods beyond surface elements you successfully forged with your original check. In that case, the observer can attempt a perception or society check against your society DC. If they succeed, they know your document is a forgery. I'm at odds with this. I think that it's worded in such a way that it allows DMs to just kind of be a little snooty if things aren't going according to their plans. Sometimes your players are going down a path and you're too scared to improvise when they're fucking up everything that you've planned. I don't like that it gives that opportunity, but I also like that it gives a DM the ability to just sensibly have someone check for a forgery in a situation where it would make sense. Every time you go to the store and you pay with a $100 bill, they have some form of forgery detection method and they don't think that you're a forger. So I think that it just gives a DM the ability to be like, hey, this makes sense. They're still going to check it for a forgery, even though they have no reason to believe that it's a forgery. I think that in that situation, it just sort of gives credence to snooty or scared DMs that are afraid to let improv take the wheel. Stealth. You are skilled at avoiding detection, allowing you to slip past foes, hide, or conceal an item. Haha, we're throwing sleight of hand in here, huh? 2 skills for the price of 1. Don't mind if I do. Why take 2 proficiency when 1 proficiency do trick? Conceal an object. You had a small object on your person, such as a weapon of light bulk. I've had a great many players try to hide a dagger in their boot or in their pants or somewhere, and that's what this is, and I like it. Once the GM rolls your check for a concealed object, that same result is used no matter how many passive observers you try to sneak it past. If a creature is specifically searching you for an item, it can attempt a perception check against your stealth DC. I like this so much more than forging in the way that it's worded. They either look passively or they actively look. The way that the forgery was worded makes it seem like, okay, well they failed the passive check, so now they're gonna do the active check, whereas in reality, it should just be some people are actively checking. You can also conceal an object somewhere other than your person, such as among undergrowth or in a secret compartment within a piece of furniture. In this case, characters seeking in an area compare their perception check results to your stealth DC to determine whether they find the object. It's weird to me that this is a stealth DC as opposed to what you rolled for the conceal. I don't understand why this is a DC as opposed to a roll now. Can you just choose to use your stealth DC instead? Kind of like trying to just take your passive in 5e as opposed to rolling? And on the other hand, if you want to potentially hide it better, could you just roll instead? Hide. You huddle behind cover, greater cover, or deeper into concealment to become hidden rather than observed. The GM rolls your stealth check in secret and compares the results to the perception DC of each creature you're observed by, but that you have cover or greater cover against or are concealed from. You gain the circumstance bonus from cover or greater cover to your check. You cease being hidden if you do anything except hide, sneak, or step. One thing that I really like is that it specifies that you can only take certain actions while you're hidden. In 5e, it's really easy to forget that you're supposed to move at half speed while you're stealthing. So I like that it implements these very specific things that already put those stipulations into play. I'm curious though, does that mean that you have to maintain your hiding the same way that you do maintaining a fly? So if you don't use 1 action per turn to continue hiding, you stop? If you attempt to strike a creature, the creature remains flat-footed against that attack, and you become observed. If you do anything else, you become observed just before you act unless the DM determines otherwise. The GM might allow you to perform a particularly unobtrusive action without being noticed, possibly requiring another stealth check. I'm also really reminded of The Last of Us when I read this condition, specifically the boss fights. A lot of the boss fights that I remember from The Last of Us are sort of 3-act kind of fights where you have to hide and then you attack the boss, and then you go back into hiding, and then once they've lost you and you get a chance, you attack the boss again, so on and so forth until you eventually beat the boss. I've never done a combat like this in 5th edition or just in general for a TTRPG, and I think that this concept would be a lot of fun. Making a map that has cover all over that you need to sneak to and from, and just having a monster that you can only hurt if you are hidden from it. Sneak. You can attempt to move to another place while becoming or staying undetected. Stride up to half your speed. You can use sneak while burrowing, climbing, flying, or swimming instead of striding if you have the corresponding movement type. You must move at half speed. This works exactly the same way it does in 5e, except they just named the actions so that you're using half of the movement. I think that this is really smart. If you're undetected by a creature and it's impossible for that creature to observe you, for a typical creature, this includes when you're invisible, the observer is blinded, or you're in darkness and that creature can't see in darkness. For any critical failure you roll on a check to sneak, you get a failure instead. You also continue to be undetected if you lose cover or greater cover against or are no longer concealed from such a creature. As I was reading this, my first thought was like, oh my, that means you can move at full speed? But no, it's still half. At the end of your movement, the GM rolls your stealth check in secret and compares the result to the perception DC of each creature you were hidden from or undetected by at the start of your movement. What? That's a lot. Honestly, I'm a little bummed that you have to make this check every time you sneak. I don't think that that makes as much sense as I'd like it to. Why take the sneak action in the first place when you could just move your full speed and then hide again if you're gonna have to hide? Oh, no, I'm dumb. I get it. Nope, that's, yeah, so if you sneak, it's like an activity where you just move half your speed and then you get a stealth check for free for one action, as opposed to moving and then hiding, which is 2 action. I get it. Okay, yeah. I still don't like that you have to re-roll the stealth check in the first place, but I suppose that negates you from having to just move, I guess? I don't know why you have to stealth check every single time. Especially if you're making some long encounter where you have to sneak for a prolonged period of time. Like, that's potentially 10 stealth checks for what would be a minute of sneaking. That's, If you have cover or greater cover from the creature throughout your stride, you gain the +2 circumstance bonus from cover or the +4 from greater cover to your stealth check. Because you're moving, the bonus increase from taking cover doesn't apply. What? That literally just contradicted itself. What? You gain the bonuses from cover, but since you're moving, you don't gain the bonuses of cover? That doesn't make any sense. Are the bonus increase from taking cover, is it talking about AC? You don't get AC improvements? I feel like this is the worst technical writing I've ever seen. Or maybe my reading comprehension is just bad, but this does not make sense. This is literally contradicting it in the very next sentence. But then if you read the take cover, it specifically says you get a bonus to sneaking. This is weird. You don't get to roll against a creature if at the end of your movement you neither are concealed from it nor have cover or greater cover against it. You automatically become observed by such a creature. I do like that it specifies that you just can't be out in the open and still be hidden from a creature. I feel like that's another thing that new players struggle with in 5e, where it's just like, I want to hide. Okay, but what are you hiding behind? You're in the middle of the road. Like, what? That's actually really cool. Even in failure, you remain hidden, but heard. I like that a lot. Only on a critical failure are you spotted and observed. I guess it takes a lot of pressure off having to roll after every sneak, although could get a bit tedious if you're doing so out of combat. Survival. You are adept at living in the wilderness, foraging for food and building shelter, and with your training you discover the secrets of tracking and hiding your trail. I like that it mentions that you're good at foraging. One of the things that I feel like a lot of players forget, especially when there's a ranger in the party, is that everyone can attempt to forage. Rangers just get double the amount of food. I also don't think that there was really ever a way to forage in 5e. They never really made rules for it as far as I'm aware. Sense direction. Using stars, the position of the sun, traits of the geography or flora, or the behavior of fauna, you can stay oriented in the wild. Typically, you attempt a survival check only once per day, but some environments or changes might necessitate rolling more often. This is actually something that my DM did. We'd always have someone take charge for that day and roll a survival check to lead the party. This would prevent us from getting lost and let other players hunt in some way, shape, or form, or keep an eye out for things possibly following us. One of the problems that I've come across in TTRPGs in general is that overland travel is one of the most tedious and mundane things that you can try and make fun. More unusual locales or those you're unfamiliar with might require you to have a minimum proficiency rank to sense direction. Without a compass, you take a -2 penalty to checks to sense direction. There are many tools in 5e that feel like they need to be a requirement but aren't really a detriment to not have. Not having a compass actually imposing a deficit to your checks, I think, is something that's actually a really neat way to encourage people to buy items that would be very obvious and likely to have in these situations. Well, this is awkward. What the fuck is the point of having a compass if a critical success just makes you a compass? This seems like really silly. This literally just negates the cool thing that I just thought was cool. I feel like they should have better success states for you if you have a compass. Also, what is an environment without cardinal directions? Is that just water? Is it just a 3D space? Cover tracks. You cover your tracks moving up to half your travel speed. You don't need to attempt a survival check to cover your tracks, but anyone tracking you must succeed at a survival check against your survival DC if it's higher than the normal DC to track. In some cases, you might cover tracks in an encounter. In this case, cover tracks is a single action and doesn't have the exploration trait. I love everything about this. From it being your survival DC if it's higher than the normal one, not needing to roll in order to do it, and to being able to do it in an encounter. What does an encounter even look like where you're covering your tracks in the middle of it? Why are you covering your tracks in the middle of an encounter? How do I make an encounter that even has that layer on top of it? That's awesome. Track. You follow tracks, moving up to half your travel speed. After a successful check to track, you can continue following the tracks at half your speed without attempting additional checks for up to 1 hour. In some cases, you might track in an encounter. In this case, track is a single action and doesn't have the exploration trait, but you might need to roll more often because you're in a tense situation. Survival has always been like this blanket to do 2 things: check for tracks and survive. There's something about the way that this gives nuance and clarification to those things that just enhance it so much for me. With this added context, it makes a 5e ranger be that much more enticing to want to play. I'm a basic bitch, and while I plan to make the rogue first, ranger is always my first go-to when it comes to making classes, and so I'm really excited to see what ranger holds in this. And again, I'm really curious to see what it's like to make an encounter where you need to check for tracks or cover them at the same time. Like, what does that look like? Why are you doing that? You attempt your survival check when you start tracking. Once every hour, you continue tracking, and anytime something significant changes in the trail. 8 survival checks if you're tracking in a single day seems like a lot, and you're just asking your players to inevitably fail. I would either not let people track someone that level of a distance, or just make it a single check that they're following. I mean, could you imagine a crit fail, letting them get 24 hours ahead, and then having to make 24 checks? I mean, don't get me wrong, I fucking love rolling my dice, but 24 checks? Thievery. You were trained in a particular set of skills favored by thieves and miscreants. I honestly thought that sleight of hand would be in Thievery, but since it's in stealth, that's, honestly surprising. I think maybe that this is sleight of hand, and I thought that concealing an object was just sleight of hand, and I stand by the bit. Palm an object. Palming a small, unattended object without being noticed requires you to roll a single thievery check against the perception DCs of all creatures who are currently observing you. You take the object whether or not you successfully conceal that you did so. Yeah, this is sleight of hand. Well, I mean, I guess this is more like a magic trick, but magic tricks are just sleight of hand. It's just, okay, moving on. Steal. You try to take a small object from another creature without being noticed. You automatically fail if the creature who has the object is in combat or on guard. Okay, look, I've played enough tactical RPGs to know that steal is just a move that you get and you can use it in combat often. Also, the idea that you have to engage in combat and steal from someone is something that I would utilize a lot. So again, these automatic fail things are something that I do not like that are just there and they keep coming back. Why do you automatically fail? Just make the DCs harder. Attempt a thievery check to determine if you successfully steal the object. The DC to steal is usually the perception DC of the creature wearing the object. This assumes the object is worn but not closely guarded, like a loosely carried pouch filled with coins or an object within such a pouch. If the object is in a pocket or similarly protected, you take a -5 penalty to your thievery check. The GM might increase the DC of your check if the nature of the object makes it harder to steal, such as a very small item in a large pack or a sheet of parchment mixed in with other documents. Okay, yeah, so I really like this. Incurring penalties depending on where it is you're trying to steal something. Almost like it would be a penalty for you to try and steal something in the middle of a fight. It might be harder to do that, huh? Not impossible, but harder. You might also need to compare your thievery check result against the perception DC of observers other than the person wearing the object. The GM may increase the perception DCs of the observers if they're distracted. I mean, let's be real, what's a better distraction than a fight, huh? I'm pretty distracted if I'm in the middle of fighting somebody. I'm pretty sure you're distracted if it makes sense to steal in fights, okay? This is a dumb rule. It's a dumb rule. Disable a device. Requirements. Some devices require you to use thieves' tools while disabling them. Honestly, it makes so much more sense to have this be in like a thievery skill than it does to just be a thieves' tool proficiency. This action allows you to disarm a trap or another complex device. Often a device requires numerous successes before becoming disabled, depending on its construction and complexity. Thieves' tools are helpful and sometimes even required to disable a device. I really like the idea that you could disable things without thieves' tools. I think that that's really cool. Just using random things like, you know, Indiana Jones just doing the bait and switch. Whoa! Successes towards disabling a complex device. Traps that require multiple successes to disarm? Oh my god. As someone that's constantly rolling 30s as a rogue with thieves' tools to check for traps and do all of these things, having it be a little skill challenge is fucking genius. It's so simple and so amazing. Also, not triggering the device with a fail is very kind. Pick a lock. Requirements, you have thieves' tools. Opening a lock without a key is very similar to disabling a device. And so is everything in the writing. Really, in the previous part, I legitimately said to lockpick and it's disabling a device. So they're the same thing, really. Locks of higher quality might require multiple successes to unlock, since otherwise even an unskilled burglar could easily crack the lock by attempting the check until they rolled a natural 20. So there's more specifics here, and I like it, especially the way that it tries to rationalize why it does what it does. Honestly, this is such a cool concept, and I wish I could have implemented it into my own games far earlier, but 7 years into the mix is not a bad time to add anything new. If you lack the proper tools, the GM might let you use improvised picks, which are treated as shoddy tools depending on the specifics of the lock. I like how items have different conditions. I think that that's a really cool way to implement bonuses, pluses, and minuses, but I'm really curious to see what those are and how often they come up. Honestly, something that I think that's really underutilized is the breaking of tools. Thieves' tools are only 3 gold or 3 silver in this? They're like 25 gold in 5th edition. I wonder why they're so cheap comparatively. We're done, we did it. The skills are mostly done. All that's left are the general skills, which are something that apply to all of them. So we'll see you on Monday for the finale of skills. And then we're gonna jump into the rogue. And that's gonna do it, folks. Until I see you all again, be well, eat well, sleep well, and dream well. See you next time.